The FBI has charged 13 people in an alleged domestic terror plot to overthrow the Michigan government that included kidnapping and potentially even killing the state's governor, Gretchen Whitmer. 6 of those men are part of a militia group who identify themselves as the Wolverine Watchman Militia. 7 other suspects have been charged with providing material support, which the law defines as anything from weapons to training. For an insider perspective, former FBI Special Agent Frank Montoya Jr. joins us now to discuss. This is such a remarkable a piece of policing, of investigation that we've seen in the last couple of hours, Frank. Undercover operations appear to be the critical component for this case. Can you tell us from your experience what it's like to be undercover and how at risk you think other operations, if any, might be?
So I never myself, at least on the criminal side, worked undercover, but I did manage a lot of those, supervise a lot of those activities. And I can tell you that it's always a challenge in many respects. There's always going to be the threat of danger to your undercovers themselves, whether they are an employee of the FBI or an informant, a confidential human source that you insert into the investigation. But there's just a lot of things that you have to be thinking about as you're engaged in these kinds of activities. Entrapment is the big one. You've got to avoid that at all costs. You've got to make sure that you get the evidence that is going to be important or necessary to make your case. And as we saw in the affidavit for this particular case, there are those moments when the undercovers or the informant are going to have to make decisions that could have a dramatic impact in the outcome of the investigation. In particular, in that instance where they were conducting one of the surveillances, and one of the individuals was talking about going rogue that night, and they had to talk him out of doing that for various reasons. One, for the safety of the individuals that were being targeted, but also because the investigation was still very much underway.
I imagine the internet, smartphones, social media, that has sort of changed the game when it comes to understanding these groups, but also getting the evidence that you need, at least for some of the individuals. They may not have talked about the plot, but spreading their philosophy online is, one of the things that they do to get more recruits. So can you talk a little bit about how just all those components, those electronic components, have changed the game?
Technology has really made the job more difficult, for one thing. The other part of that is that when it comes to radicalization in general, I mean, in the old days, it was a group of people getting together and maybe sharing information in person. The reach was just not as expensive as it is now. These days, an individual, they're as close to the radical ideology as a click of a button. And especially in the age of COVID, when you're not getting out, people aren't getting out as much, they're staying home more. Something's got to fill and occupy the time. And so getting on the internet is a way that we do that. And to be able to reach out to these kinds of groups, or at least get to websites where they preach these kinds of ideologies, is very, very simple. And there are a lot of impressionable people out there, or angry people out there, or folks that want to make their mark in the world, and they see that the technology as the first step to get them to that place where they can do these kinds of things.
As you know, just last month, FBI Director Christopher Wray told lawmakers that the Bureau was investigating people involved in recent protests nationwide. Take a listen to this.
First, terrorism remains the FBI's top priority, although the nature of that threat has evolved significantly since 9/11. We do not investigate groups or individuals based on ideology or the exercise of First Amendment protected activity alone. But when the ideology leads someone to commit criminal acts and pursue violence, the FBI will not hesitate to take appropriate action.
So, Frank, let me ask you about, in your experience, the roots of all of this. I mean, Director Wray went on to say that white supremacy and domestic terrorism remains one of the greatest threats that this country faces. I note that back in the 1920s, the membership of Americans in the KKK was about 4 million. 4 million Americans were members of the KKK in the 1920s. And then from then on, we started to see a drop-off in groups like that. What, in your estimation, and this is a question that I've asked this of former Director Comey, I've asked this of former Assistant Director McCabe, I ask everybody who's affiliated with the FBI this question because I'm really intrigued as to what they see as the reasons why we are seeing an uptick in membership in groups like these.
Yeah, it's another great question. It's something that has plagued this country from its very beginning. When you look at, go beyond even the 1920s, when you go into the 19th century, and some of the things that even government institutionalized in terms of separate but equal, or the fact that certain individuals, certain citizens of this country weren't as valued as other citizens in this country. So there's been an evolution. And some of it has been positive, some of it has been negative in how we look at each other in terms of race, in terms of class. And what you see is what you expect and what you hope is that evolution, it eventually gets to the point where there is no such things as racism, or there's no such thing as class warfare. But we haven't been able to overcome, I think, those kinds of prejudices. And then when you enter into a period of time like we have, say, in the last 4 years, where the dog whistles become bullhorns, it's easier for these kinds of behaviors to come to the forefront, and it's easier for people to think that it's legit or that it's righteous to join these kinds of groups to protect a particular ideology that they may adhere to, or to a particular personality that they like. And so, it in some respects, you wished that it had gone away, that we had evolved to the point where we weren't that kind of country anymore. But the fact of the matter is, it's always going to be there, and part of it is attributable to human nature, part of it is attributable to the politics and the ideology of the times, and that's why you see the growth. And then going back to the technology, it's so much easier today to spread whatever kind of ideology that you may want to support or to defend or to promulgate, and it just makes it easier for people to latch onto those ideas. And then the next thing you have is are those folks that actually intend to act, that act or intend to act on their beliefs, and that's where we have these challenges that we face today.
You used the word legit when you kind of talked about people kind of being able to access different philosophies or political points of view that kind of overlap with some of the stuff that maybe this militia group might have believed in. And Vlad talked about the KKK, and then I started to think about, that was an organization with sort of a hierarchy. So I wanted to ask you, how have things evolved from, say, when the KKK was in its heyday, for lack of a better phrase? When you look at these groups, I mean, is there a hierarchy? Is this about leadership, or is it about a generalized political philosophy that is starting to sort of seep into the mainstream?
It's another great question. In those days, we focused a lot on organizations. What you're seeing now is an evolution towards, and it's reflected in, for instance, how the Bureau characterizes these kinds of activities, where it used to be, when in my day, it was domestic terrorism organizations, and now it's domestic violent extremists or extremism. And so, again, technology, I think, plays a role in that, where it's, in the old days, it was about focusing on the organization, on that, the hierarchy, so to speak, the leadership in particular. And now it's much more, it seems at least, to be a lot more freewheeling, where, it can be elements of an ideology that start promulgating a particular idea or thought or threat. And, and then they begin to coalesce. They begin to coalesce into what I guess could be, considered an organization, or at least a group with a goal and an objective that plans together to execute these ideas to achieve a goal. And again, part of the challenge of these kinds of investigations, particularly when it comes to domestic terrorism, is what is legitimate, what is First Amendment protected speech, and then where does it cross the line, and when does law enforcement need to get engaged? And this case up in Michigan is, I think, a really good example of how that evolves, of how that goes from being just ideas on the internet or ideas amongst a group of people into the threat of action.
You know, it's such an interesting point that both you and Anne-Marie are making, Agent Montoya, because you know, going back to the point that we were making about the KKK, and Anne-Marie pointed to the hierarchy, there was a hierarchy, and there was a very overt racist message in that organization and other organizations like the White Citizens Council. But what we've started to see in the last 10 or 15 or 20 years is a couching of the language where, you know, people will say it's more about, you know, states' rights, and it's more about not trampling on individual liberty, like this mask mandate.
Second Amendment.
Exactly, the Second Amendment. It's a reaction to Black Lives Matter, which, of course, as everybody knows, Black Lives Matter is not seeking to say that Black lives are worth more than others. It's just the equitable treatment under the law. You're starting to see this language as if it somehow adheres to what they believe are the revolutionary ideas of the United States of America, meaning the actual revolution, and yet they are no different than those folks who were members of the KKK. And more importantly, I think, Agent Montoya, which is interesting, is they have adapted the very same tactics of the people that they claim to hate. They claim to hate Islamic extremists. They claim to hate what is happening with ISIS or Al-Qaeda across in the Middle East. But the tactics that they use and the ways that they propagate and the ways that they communicate are almost, I'm guessing, based on your experience, similar. In other words, those tactics are being used right here in the United States. They've been adopted by these white extremist groups.
That's another great point. When you talk about radicalization on the internet, where did that originate? That originated in our investigations, you know, looking at Al-Qaeda and more specifically at ISIS, where we were seeing these facilitators, these enablers, typically overseas, say in Syria or in Iraq, who are reaching out to individuals around the world, but particularly in the United States, through the internet, to radicalize them one by one, and basically saying, you don't need to come over here to the war zone in Syria or to Iraq or to Yemen or Somalia, but instead conduct the acts of terror in your own home, in your own homeland. And we're seeing the exact same kinds of functionality of process when it comes to these violent domestic violent extremists, where, you know, they're connecting with each other via the internet, in chat rooms, in social media. They're plotting and they're planning, and then they're executing. And sometimes it's an individual that may walk into a store, or in this instance, you know, plotting and planning to kidnap, terrorize a governor. And so, yeah, in terms of the process, it's very, very similar. And it is what causes investigators, particularly in the FBI, but even at the state and local level, a lot of concern, because how do you monitor or manage, you know, all of that First Amendment protected activity out there, you know, and in one hand, ensure that it continues, but on the other hand, address the threats of violence or the violent action that occurs out there. We can't always be reactionary about it. We have to be, you know, preventative as well as disruptive. And so, yeah, that's where there's another friction in terms of law enforcement, in one, protecting civil liberties, but on the other hand, preventing and disrupting these potential acts of violence.
All right. Former Special Agent Frank Montoya Jr., thank you so much for your insight. We appreciate it.
Appreciate the time. Thank you very much.